Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Bridge Atlas series. I'm Christine Kim, the host of this series, and in today's episode, we are going to be discussing Ethereum through the lens of hardness and planetary thinking. If this is your very first time listening to a Bridge Atlas episode, I do encourage all of our listeners to please go back and listen to the very first episode in this series that goes over kind of the theme of the series and will give you more context for future Bridge Atlas episodes. But for this episode, I'm very excited because I am going to be introducing our guests now for the episode for our discussion on hardness and planetary thinking. For this episode, I am joined by Nils Gilman, the executive editor of the Berggruen Press and the deputy editor of Noema magazine. Hi, Nils.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. And we are also joined by Josh Stark, who is part of the management committee at the Ethereum Foundation. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Christine. Very happy to be here.
Yes. And for some of our listeners who have been following along with Summer of Protocols, some of our listeners should already know you guys because you've done guest talks for Summer of Protocols. And for any of our listeners who, however, did not see those talks will be linked into the show notes of today's episode. And these are actually the individuals that came up with the terms that we're going to be talking about, planetary thinking and hardness. So it's kind of exciting. We have the two experts on hardness and planetary thinking in the room with us. So as an icebreaker, though, I thought it would be really good for both Nils and Josh for you guys to just give our listeners some context on your background and also on these terms that we're going to be discussing quite heavily in today's episode. So Nils, do you want to go first? Give a bit of an introduction of who you are, your background, and planetary thinking.
Sure. Thanks, Christine. I'm super happy to be here and really look forward to this conversation, Josh. So I was trained as a historian. I got my PhD from Berkeley in American history. And a lot of my thinking about planetary stuff actually comes out of that work really 30 years ago now, where I was interested. This was the heyday of globalization in the 1990s. And I was writing actually about I was studying and researching a previous era of sort of big terminology, which was modernization and modernization theory. And the move from modernization to globalization to planetary is kind of one of the themes that I want to talk about today at some, get into that in some detail. But I think the trajectory that got me to planetary thinking in the last 5 years, I think there's a 20-year gap between that. And I think it's important to sort of track some milestones along the way. One is that, when I finished my PhD, I did not go into academia. I went into tech. And I spent the first 6.5 years of my career working at enterprise software companies in the Valley. And that gave me a lot. I didn't know very much about technology before I did that, but that apprenticeship, if you want to call it that, really got me a lot deeper into thinking about the ways in which the systems of globalization are really underpinned by these really important technological substrates, and that the development of those technologies actually, as much as anything people think about in politics or in the realm of ideas, is what really drives change over time. And from there, I've had a couple of other stops in my career. I spent 7 years doing consulting. A lot of it was with intelligence agencies thinking about really long-range future stuff and thinking about not sort of tactical things concerning the war on terror, for example, but thinking about things like, what does the rise of China mean for the world, for the United States?
Mm-hmm.
What does climate change mean as a security problem over time? And questions of that sort. And those kind of confluence of concerns about the sort of role of big ideas, the role of technology, and the sort of thinking about the global challenges is really what led me to thinking about planetary stuff in the last 5 years when I've been at the Berggruen Institute, which is a research and think tank based in Los Angeles. And basically, we'll get into it in a lot more detail, but just to give the one sentence summary on it, planetary thinking is about thinking about the flows of things that go around the world that are not things that humans are intentionally moving around the world, right? So globalization is about the flows of things that we move intentionally: money, goods, services, ideas, bits, bytes. Those are all the things that we talk about when we talk about globalization. The planetary is all the other things that are flowing around the world that are being affected by humans, but aren't things that humans are intentionally moving around. So those could be things like, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the space junk, the oceanic plastics, et cetera, et cetera. All of those kinds of things are planetary phenomena as opposed to global phenomena, which are human-based things. And those planetary phenomena lack any systems today that are effectively governing them. We've got a lot of systems to govern the flows of global goods and services and things like that, but we have very few effective systems today to manage planetary challenges. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Well, perhaps one of the systems that we'll talk about later in this episode will be Ethereum. I'm very excited to talk a little bit on how the Ethereum protocol might play a role in this area and field of study. But before we get into that, Josh, can you share also more about your background, your area of expertise, and also the definition that you have brought to this term hardness in studying protocols?
Christine, and thanks, Nils, for the introduction. So I'm Josh. I've worked in the Ethereum ecosystem for a long time now. A very long time ago, I was a lawyer. So I went to law school and worked for a year at a big firm in downtown Toronto where I live, and didn't love it, left and found my way into this wacky world. And I think that background as a lawyer has definitely influenced how I've thought about and reasoned about crypto and blockchains and Ethereum over time. The idea of smart contracts made complete sense to me immediately. That, like, of course, you should be able to do complex conditional logic in code if you can have, identities and assets in a single platform. Over the years, I've done a few different things. I co-founded a company called ETH Global that runs large Ethereum hackathons around the world in 2017. Also a company called L4 that was doing very early L2 R&D. Before rollups, before Plasma, there was the idea of state channels, and we would do all Ethereum applications in those. It was a stop on the way of the R&D journey to where we are today, but it was not the be-all, end-all solution. And then I started working at the EF in late 2020, where I've been part of the leadership or management team ever since. So to jump into the hardness piece, I mean, my day job isn't, kind of writing and thinking about these things, but like throughout this journey, there's always been something that bothered me about the way that we talked and thought about blockchains. And it's not even really how we talk about blockchains, but it's how we think about other things that are similar to blockchains in some way. So, the basic story is that blockchains come on the scene and suddenly they can do things like really in practice that previously really only institutions could do, right? In most people's experience with money today is in the form of fiat currency. And, what makes that money real is the existence of a set of institutions that, give it durability, give it reliability, make it possible for people to use it. And suddenly we have a network piece of software that can do something that in practice people are really using, like money. The other thing that we can suddenly do are contracts, right? It really, started to become true in the, mid 2010s that you could do basically a complex financial contract of some kind on Ethereum. That previously, like, the only way anyone ever did that was using institutions, using law and legal contracts, which at the end of the day, like, only matter or exist if there's a set of institutions behind them that give them, real durability, real form, real function. So if those things are true, then there must be something that blockchains and institutions have in common. These aren't like opposite systems that have nothing to do with each other. And often we talk that way because we would say that one is centralized and the other is decentralized, and so they're opposites. But even though they're using different means, there's clearly something they have in common, but we had no name for that. We have no word for that. So that is what I'm trying to get at with this idea of hardness. And to give a quick definition, the way I talk about it is that hardness is the capability of a system to make a specific outcome very likely to be true in the future, usually for the purpose of some kind of social coordination. So let me give you some examples using that terminology. I'm confident in the specific outcome that the assets currently held in my Ethereum wallet will still be there a year or 2 or 5 from now. As long as I don't, lose the keys, they'll still be there. And the reasons that claim is very likely to be true have to do with what Ethereum is. That, there are certain cryptographic guarantees that are offered that mean that no one can, take my private key from me easily. There's a set of economic incentives built into the protocol that create strong assurances that the system will keep running into the future. Ethereum is a source of hardness that gives hardness to the claim, the outcome, the expectation that my money will still be there. An institutional example would be that I'm also confident that the money that I hold in my retirement savings account at a Canadian bank will still be there in 5 years. And the reason that outcome is likely to be true is, again, it's about a set of institutions, that there's a legal system that governs my relationship with the bank. The bank itself is an institution that has certain safeguards and is likely to be there. And ultimately, those assets are covered by the CDIC in Canada, which is analogous to the FDIC in the US, where the federal government guarantees some amount of your assets are always insured. These are two different sources of hardness, and they're very different in how they're constructed, but ultimately the thing that they're doing is very, very similar.
Josh, can I ask you a question about hardness? Which, by the way, let me just say right up front, when I saw your lecture on this, it's rare for me to get introduced to a totally new concept, and I'm like, whoa! Then you see it everywhere. So I think it's a great concept. One thing I think would be really helpful, especially since I didn't actually know that your background was as a lawyer or trained as a lawyer. What's the difference? So lawyers talk a lot about reliability or relying on people, right? That's like a term of art in the law, is that if I rely on you, reliance. How is hardness different from reliance or reliability?
You're pushing me back into my law school days here.
Sorry,
I'll have to quickly remember. The basic idea, as I recall it, and this is not legal advice, talk to a real lawyer, but reliance in a contract is the idea that if you have a relationship with somebody and you are in reliance on them, meaning it's clear from your behavior and your communication that there's an expectation that you will really deliver these goods because I need them to build my building, then that can, that is a factor in a court deciding, is there a contract and what's the nature of that contract? So it's kind of a position of, through the behavior of people, is one acting in reliance on another. So the way I'd contrast that with hardness is that, reliance and similar ideas maybe of trust are, they're about the mental states of people, and they're about the behavior of people and how we perceive or expect things to go. Maybe that's the behavior of a person, maybe it's something else, but they're really about almost an internal mental state or a social relationship. Hardness is trying to get away from that in a way and fill a different niche in our language. It's a property that a system has, right? Ethereum has hardness, whether or not anyone ever uses it, right? It might be true or it might be not. The system really well keep running. A legal institution can have hardness whether or not I believe it does. If I'm someone that's deeply skeptical of all governance systems and I would never, sign a contract with somebody, I might have that belief. I might not act in reliance on them. I might not trust the government, but it might be independently true that this system as a whole really is very likely to, behave in a certain way and have a certain level of reliability. So that's how I would compare those two ideas.
I have another question about hardness. I think that hardness really gets to this, at the crux of hardness is trust. How confident can you be that these institutions in your life that seem immovable are really going to stay in the future? And the context, the global context in which we're having this conversation, there's just a massive erosion of trust in our world for institutions like universities, democracy as a whole, governments. And it seems so wild to me. Science. And it seems so wild to me that we could even fathom such a new technology like Ethereum could possibly have more hardness than these institutions, these other man-made institutions that we thought was going to be hard, but is breaking down as we speak. I'd love your guys' take on, I guess, the factors that are contributing to the erosion of trust that we see in our world, and are those factors also the same factors that are that Ethereum is susceptible to being eroded, Ethereum's hardness being eroded over time? Maybe Nils, do you want to start us off on the biggest contributing factors of erosion of trust in our day? Because of that, I worry about that, and also in the context of how much can we trust in this protocol, this very new protocol, technically speaking, of Ethereum?
we'll get into the trust for Ethereum in a minute, but I think, just to preview something I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. I think one of the reasons why there's been a lot of interest and attraction to Ethereum is that, it's a beacon of hope for an alternative model of trust building and trust management in a context where traditional institutions are in severe decline and decay. But to just talk about historically how we got to that point, I mean, let's talk about some data. If you go to Pew has been Pew Research, the polling outfit. They've been doing polls on standard questions since the late 1960s or early 1970s on trust in a whole variety of institutions in the United States. I don't know whether they do it in other countries, but there's similar data for other countries. In almost every single institution in American life, there's been a very steady secular decline in how much trust people have in those institutions. Big businesses, local government, state government, federal government, the judiciary, the churches, the universities, science. And so it's been a really steady process of decline in trust. And there are inflection points that I think are important. There actually was a huge decline in trust in the U.S. military in the 1970s, and then it bounced back quite a lot. Actually, it's interesting that in the U.S., the two institutions that are, according to this data, that have not experienced, they've experienced some decline in trust, but not nearly as much as other institutions, are the military and small businesses. Almost every other institution they're polling on has been just straight downhill lines. And I think it's interesting to ask, why are those two institutions not exempt, but relatively immunized from the decline in trust? And I have a hypothesis about this that I don't know how to test, let alone prove, but I think it's something about accountability. So I think that there's a sense that the elites who run many of the institutions in our lives, the churches, the government, the universities, the big corporations, are essentially immunized from any consequences from bad actions. The exception, but not if you're a small business person and not if you're in the military. I mean, top military leaders get fired on a regular basis. Trump's been firing lots of them. Obama fired lots of them, right? People get fired because they fail at their task at the top level. So the elites that are in charge of these institutions are accountable. And also, obviously, if you're a soldier or in the Navy or whatever, you're at personal risk. I mean, you're taking on real risks that generates respect that people have, and that redounds to the trust people have in the institutions. People are putting their lives on the line for these institutions. I mean, I don't know the data, but I bet people still trust firemen a lot, right? For the same kinds of reasons. People are putting their lives on the line for the mission of the organization. For all these other institutions, there's a real sense that the elites are, in many cases, self-dealing, but in almost all cases, when they screw up, they don't personally face any consequences. And I think that has led to a huge decline in trust. And so I think one of the reasons why, and Josh, maybe I don't know if you'll agree with this, but my sense is that one of the reasons why people are attracted to things like blockchain-based services is they're we don't have to rely on self-dealing elites in order for these systems to work. These systems, have a backing of code that people can't undermine. And that's of course not totally true, but at least in principle, their design is set up to be relatively uncorruptible. And I think that that's one reason why many people are attracted to them, is they're alienated from the legacy institutions, and they look to things like Ethereum as providing a more reliable, in the colloquial sense of trust. I don't know if you agree with that, Josh, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think I do. I think that has always been at the core of the story that began with Bitcoin, of what this ecosystem is trying to do. Can we create systems that aren't vulnerable to capture, to corruption, to corrosion, that rely as little as possible on any specific institution, that we're never putting all of our eggs in one basket. I think that that is always going to be at the soul of what crypto is about and what Ethereum is about. And I think succeeding in that vision is still something that we're all working on. In the case of Bitcoin, there's a very contentious debate going on right now around what the people that maintain Bitcoin Core, the primary or only Bitcoin client should do. Within the Ethereum ecosystem, obviously there's many client teams that, don't always agree with each other. The EF has its own role in, helping kind of steward and coordinate the ecosystem. And it's on the minds of all these people and organizations, how do we make sure that this system doesn't depend on us, so that the bust factor is low? If a person goes away or an institution goes away or a company goes away, it must be true that Ethereum will continue despite all that. So I definitely agree that's part of the appeal. I think the distinction I'd make is that, coming back to also your initial question, Christine, I don't think I'm an expert by any means in, sentiment on institutions globally, but I'd make a distinction between where people are losing confidence in institutions because they're losing confidence in maybe like moral legitimacy, or, can this institution function well and make good decisions? I think that's part of the story you have around universities, where as part of the culture war, different people are losing confidence in just like, is this a morally just institution that I should, give legitimacy and treat as like a neutral educational institution in our society? And I think that's different than the more narrow thing of losing confidence in just like the hardness of the institution, right? Like when you think about a justice system, for example, you might lose confidence that like the judges will apply the law fairly or make good decisions. But then you also might just wonder, well, like if I sign a contract today, will I even be able to enforce it? Like, is the basic durability that I expect from the legal system going to be there or not? And with the justice system, those things are very intertwined because the purpose of this thing is both to make, pseudo-moral legal judgments and also to be able to reliably do that into the future so that we can, actually have these systems. So I think they are different things, but maybe the point with Ethereum is that it's maybe a bad thing, and when we're thinking about how to build our civilization, that, if a culture war happens and people stop politically agreeing with an institution, that also means we lose a source of hardness that governs really basic stuff like financial contracts. Like kind of part of the beauty of, doing this with blockchains with Ethereum is that, Ethereum isn't going to, I don't know, it's not an institution. It's not like a building with a bunch of people in it that might hire the wrong people. It's a network, it's a piece of software. And so it's still going to adjudicate the code of the smart contract, regardless of, who works on what client or what have you. And so it's less likely that confidence in Ethereum's hardness would be debilitated or impacted by more like culture, social level stuff.
That's a really interesting nuance that you point out, Josh, because as we were talking about trust, not hardness, we mentioned a couple of ideas around evaluating trust and measuring the erosion of trust. Nils, you mentioned accountability. Josh, you mentioned the bust factor. In your sense of the nuanced definition of hardness, which doesn't necessarily tie to, I guess, like the moral beliefs or alignment of values, are there specific evaluations of hardness that differs from trust? I know, Josh, I want you to mention a little bit about this like trust experience index that you had mentioned. In protocol studies, there's also different measures and frameworks like the Kafka index, dimensions of sufficiency, to try and evaluate like the hardness of a protocol. And I'm wondering if there's more effective or less effective ways that you think really get at the heart of like seeing if Ethereum really is hard over time, or if there's like changes in the level of hardness that might be different from measuring trust in Ethereum, just like general social trust.
Yeah, I think they're different things. I guess to give the zoom out big picture here, so Christine's referencing another essay I wrote called Introducing Trust Experience or something like that. And the idea of trust experience is that like it is an analog to UX. So, user experience is about like, how does a person interact with this thing? What is their experience using it? Can they, interact with the interface to achieve their objectives or not? And how does that work? Trust experience is the idea of like, what is the relationship someone has to like coming to the point of trusting something? Like when someone is, let's say, like walking up to a bridge and they're thinking, do I trust that bridge to get me across this chasm or not? They're looking at various things. They might see if other people have walked across it recently. They might, kind of lean down and expect, like, are the ropes frayed or not? Maybe they're an engineer and they have specific spec knowledge or not. That is the trust experience of that bridge. And there's similarly a trust experience for choosing to interact with your legal system or choosing to interact with a smart contract. So trust experience and hardness to me are kind of two opposite ends of a spectrum. One is, again, about this mental state of like, how do people relate to systems that may or may not be trustworthy? And then hardness is like a property of a system that it has or doesn't that, make it a candidate for trustworthiness or not. So there's kind of two different ends of it. And so how you measure them are very different. On the trust experience side of things, you might look at, I guess by measurement, I mean, like, how do you quantify how people do this, or what is the level of trust? And again, it's about psychological factors or who they look to for examples or what knowledge they bring to the table. And on the hardness side, I think that is trickier. I'm not sure that there is one quantifiable metric for hardness. People will measure the decentralization of blockchains in some kind of basic naive ways of like how many nodes are there, or across how many entities is the stake spread, or what are the financial penalties for different things. We could also look at within that system, what are the assurances you have about specific smart contracts? What are the assurances you have about the cryptographic primitives that are being used in these systems? Are they quantum secure or not? There's a lot of surface area to look at when you think about, like, is Ethereum hard or not? I think it's analogous to how we talk about security. There's kind of like I forget the exact wording, but there's an adage in, computer security that's something like, there's no such thing as just security. There is security against specific threats. And so you can evaluate, empirically and quantifiably maybe whether something is secure against a specific threat model or threat actor. But it's very difficult to say in the abstract is something secure against every possible threat actor or threat model. And I think hardness is kind of similar. You really do need to think about your use case and what like attacks or like failures you're worried about, and then evaluate that specifically.
Can I just build on that? Because I think that it's interesting to use that, the trust versus hardness to think about legacy institutions too, right? So Christine, you brought up universities, right? Universities are actually incredibly hard institutions in Josh's terms. I mean, if you look at various people have put together lists of the oldest institutions in the world, there's the Catholic Church, but if you look at the 500 oldest institutions in the world, there's always a question of whether the thing that we're looking at in 2025 is actually the same thing as was there in 1600. But, Oxford, a huge percentage of these things are universities like Oxford and Harvard and Cambridge and Bologna. And of course, they're performing very different functions now than they did 200 years ago, let alone 600 years ago, right? But they are hard in the sense that they continue to do many of the same things. They have students, they produce degrees, people come there when they're in their late teens, right? There's a kind of a rhythm that they've managed to sustain over time. And obviously in each one of those cases, there's been years when they shut down because there was a war or a plague or whatever, but they've resuscitated themselves. What I think we're seeing right now is not that these institutions are losing hardness, specifically universities. I think what they're doing is they're massively losing trust. I'm totally confident that there's going to be, something with red bricks and Ivies that's handing out degrees in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that's called Harvard University in 20 years and 50 years, and assuming it's not underwater in 100 years. I'm not that confident that people have lost a lot of trust in that as an institution. There's a huge amount of respect that has disappeared from Harvard as an institution. It used to be, going to Harvard was the defining thing that made you an elite in America, right? And I think that has imploded catastrophically because of the things that both of you were referencing. And so I think that you can have a trust loss while maintaining institutional hardness. And so I think it is a really useful distinction that you're making there, Josh.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, one last question regarding this, and then I want to shift the second half of our conversation to talking more about some of the planetary challenges that we have and blockchains in the context of it, which is definitely related to what we've been talking about. But if an institution stays hard, if a protocol stays hard through the decades and through the centuries, but trust erodes. Does hardness matter?
I think that's exactly the right question. A thing I feel like I say all the time is that it is not enough for Ethereum to be decentralized and secure and have these good properties. The world has to know about it. People can only use something that they can understand, and that was that's part of my motivation for writing these ideas down. Is that I don't know how effective it's been, but I think we need ways of bridging that gap of showing people that crypto and blockchains and Ethereum are not something that's wacky and terrifying and strange and alien. It's actually it's an engine for producing one of the oldest things that we have as humans. Like the root bedrock of civilization is the ability to coordinate and trust each other. And this is a way of doing this with different properties and at a different scale, and to do different things. But it's not alien. It's not strange. It is something very, very fundamental. And I think the more that people can get that idea, the more it is easy to look at these systems and think about how you can trust them and in what circumstances and actually use them. So yeah, it's not enough if a tree falls in the forest, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we really do need to tell the world about the awesome thing that our community has built and help them understand it.
Yeah, just responding to that, Josh, I'm not part of the blockchain community really at all. And so I'm a friendly observer from outside, but like I know only enough to be dangerous about this topic. But it seems to me that there's two big challenges that the chain face. Well, the two that I see from a person who sits outside of it is, the first one is that like it's still really technically hard for people who aren't like really technically deep to understand exactly how it works. And I think that creates, for non-technical people, it's a leap of faith to a large extent.
Yeah.
And that particularly, so like if somehow there could be a way to make it like way, the UX, could become super duper easy in the way that like, I don't know, the first internet browsers made accessing the internet like way, way easier, right? Or the iPhone made mobility, mobile internet way, way easier to deal with. I think, we await that moment in the blockchain world, and I hope it arrives. And the second problem is, in the meanwhile, there's a whole bunch of grifters and scammers that have attached themselves to the world, right? And not Ethereum, but like, and that means that like, unfortunately, there's been this crowding in of, people who just use it to scam, basically, and like, or to, do illicit transactions or whatever it is. And I'm thinking more about the cryptocurrency end of things than, the smart contract end of things necessarily. But like, that's where the public imagination about these technologies, unfortunately, has been colonized. Now, of course, a lot of people are like, oh my God, it's my get rich quick scheme opportunity, right? But I don't think that's a great space for sustaining long-term commitment to it, unfortunately. And I say this, I don't say this as a criticism. I say this more as an analysis. I don't know how you'd react to any of that.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. Like, I think we should be realistic about the situation that we're in as an ecosystem right now. And the way that like I think about these things and the way I talk about them, and what excites me and still makes me passionate about this space is pretty opposite to what a lot of people, outside looking in, see as what this is. And there's lots of reasons for that. It's a permission system, so anyone can lay claim to it. It's a system where there's a lot of financial applications, which means that it's a space for extremely financialized motives. There's been various kind of legal and regulatory gaps that have allowed bad actors to flourish. Like there's all sorts of contributing factors I can name, but it doesn't change the fact that there is that big reputational deficit. I do believe it can change. I think I don't have the stats in front of me, but if you look at a graph of like smart contract hacks in DeFi and the Ethereum ecosystem, it's really come down, right? There absolutely was a period of time a few years ago where these things happened every few months. But there really have been improvements in the smart contract standards, the security practices that firms use, the developer experience that makes it easy to do these things securely. It really has gotten better, and smart contract security is much less of an issue right now than it was a few years ago.
Totally.
But there's still massive improvements being made in helping people through their wallets avoid scams, just having the basic education of knowing what to do. There's, an almost infinite amount of work to be done. One thing I often think about is that, you're the historian, so you can tell me this comparison is way off base, but there was a time when California was a space of, never-do-wells and a lot of, scams and crime and get-rich-quick schemes, from the gold rush to everything else. And certainly as a community, it didn't have the best reputation. It was a place you went to get rich quick, maybe fail, maybe leave. But over time, that kind of Wild West did turn into an economy that, did change and is now like a home of like a lot of vibrant, economic, political, social, everything else. So I guess my hope for Ethereum is to be a little bit like California, a bit wild in its early days, but gets its act together and becomes, one of the largest economies on Earth, and a place that people from all over the world can come to.
I love the outside perspective, Nils. I think that is really at the crux of what Bridge Atlas is about. And not just outside perspectives on Ethereum, but turning the tables of Ethereum perspectives on some outside or seemingly outside issues. So I think we should talk a little bit about some of the planetary challenges that our world is facing and discuss how potentially Ethereum is can be used or its place of relevance at all. One of the planetary challenges that I read up on and that you have been talking quite a bit about, Nils, is this idea that the diplomatic machinery overseeing these technological breakthroughs, especially the ones around AI, which I'm hoping in this series we'll also be able to talk more deeply on AI, that some of this diplomatic machinery is just not enough to keep up with these advancements. Can you give us kind of like give us the intro to this planetary challenge, and then we can start discussion and go from there.
Right. So how do I cut into this? I guess the best way to maybe think about this is that, diplomacy, as it's traditionally understood, is basically the way different national governments talk to each other, right? And it used to be that, there's foreign minister and he talks to the foreign minister in another country, and that's how diplomacy happens, right? And, when that breaks down, you end up in a war, and so you don't want that. And traditional diplomacy, as it evolved historically, basically in Europe, in the early modern era, as nation states arose, was the protocol language was French, and what you were expected to know was the general history of border disputes and the flows of people and the religious disputes in different kinds of countries, and those kinds of general knowledges were what diplomats were trained to do. Up through into the 1980s, if you weren't fluent in French, you could not be a diplomat in the world, right? The United Nations ended up using mainly English, and this was a huge fight. And the only reason why we won is because we put it in the U.S. and it's because the UN was set up after the U.S. won the war, and the French were they also were on the winning side, but they were not in a real position to dominate that, right? But that was the kind of training that diplomats had. And then, starting in the 1970s, which is when the term globalization really begins to emerge to describe the integration of, economies across borders, people realize that actually our diplomats need to understand different things, right? They need to actually understand trade flows. They need to understand have some basic economic knowledge. They need to understand how, international finance settlement works. How do international bond markets work? If you actually want to understand how countries are relating to each other in an era of globalization, you have to have some basics of economics and finance. And so that becomes, starting in the 70s and really gets fully institutionalized in the 80s, a core part of the training of diplomats. So if you go to any foreign service school anywhere in the world today, you're expected to have some basic knowledge. And when I say basic, you're expected to take a couple of classes. You don't necessarily need to know how to do complicated, either spreadsheets or regression analyses of various things, but you got to be fluent in the language of international financial flows. I believe that we're now emerging in an era where something similar is about to happen with respect to these planetary challenges. If you don't know something about carbon accounting, if you don't know something about, what the what's going on with the governance of outer space in terms of where all the satellites are going and how the debris is being monitored and handled. If you don't know something about the technology, and we'll get into this more, that's being used to actually assess what's going on in the oceans, in the atmospheres, at the poles. If you don't have some basic scientific and technical knowledge about the way those things work, you're going to be essentially illiterate for dealing with the biggest challenges that I think we're going to face throughout the rest of this century. And so, one of the initiatives I've been working on is I've been working with some of the foreign service schools here in the United States and also some of them in Europe to actually start to think about what would a curriculum look like that would give that kind of knowledge, both at the technical level and understanding actually the systems. And this will get us to the Ethereum question. What are actually the systems that we are building that allow us to know about what's happening with, the perturbation of these planetary flows? So that's the basic issue.
The time is now. We're going to talk about the systems now. Josh, this is the moment. What are your views on either this particular planetary challenge around the diplomatic machinery that needs to be updated, or, planetary challenges like it, where Ethereum as a global technology could be, the adjudicator potentially of these horizontal and vertical global conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, I will say again, I certainly don't feel like I'm an expert in, your domain, Nils. So I think my ideas are probably naive at the very least. But there is some, there's interesting work being done here, and there are some big vision possibilities maybe that are interesting. I mean, one thing that where we've seen crypto intersect with these bigger challenges is around, I guess, giving people tools to coordinate in environments that are maybe authoritarian, or there are other limitations on how they can participate in governance. There's this great project called Raramo in the Ethereum ecosystem, and they've built something called Freedom Tool, and it's been deployed in Russia, Iran, and Georgia. And it's basically a system that uses zero knowledge proofs, so that basically anyone can take their national ID and prove to this system that, yes, they really are a Russian citizen or an Iranian citizen. And then, without revealing any information about who they are or their identity, they can prove that and vote in an online poll. And it's been used by opposition activists to, be able to kind of provably say to the world, we polled 200,000 people in Moscow, and, here's what they think. And, it's been used to kind of contest the legitimacy of elections. So I think there's something there in terms of giving people tools that, have once been limited to national borders, but with a little more durability, right? Like an online poll is one thing, but an online poll secured by Ethereum or a zero knowledge proof proves that these are not bots, these are real citizens with real opinions. I think that's something different and novel. And if you want to extend that idea further, something I've said before, and I'll say again, is I think the first time that 1 billion humans ever vote on something, whether it's consequential or not, it'll happen through Ethereum. The current record is 600 and some million in the most recent Indian election, but 1 billion people all around the world. I think the only way you could legitimately do that and provably do that is the combination of zero knowledge proofs to prove identity and uniqueness, and Ethereum to bring all the votes together. So I think imagine a world where we can regularly poll the entire global citizenry on important issues. That seems like it could be a really powerful starting point or primitive that is used for some of these planetary institutions that you're interested in setting up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, let me just extend that a little bit. So in the world of planetary thinking, there's a big debate about people who are more on the end of what we need to do is build institutions. A lot of those people are kind of committed to legacy institutions at the United Nations that I think are not going to possibly work. My proposals have been more about building new kinds of institutions. But then there's another whole pole of the debate, which I think is really important to emphasize. And I kind of try to straddle both ends of these because I think it's a both and, which is how much is technology and technological systems actually going to be the de facto way in which global, planetary systems get governed, right? So just an example that I think is really interesting on this, and I'll get to an Ethereum point in a moment, but like people have set up sensor arrays in the St. Lawrence Seaway. You probably know about this, Josh, but also in the Santa Barbara Channel in California that are detecting where there are whales in these channels. And, whales running into ships cause a lot of damage to ships, often are fatal to the whales. These are really bad things. They're now setting down sensor arrays in these channels that are whale heavy and ship heavy. And the sensors go directly to the guidance systems of the ships, right? I mean, there's an intermediate layer, transmitted through satellites, but like basically they immediately tell the ships, this is where the whales are, and redirect the ships automatically, right? So the ships are automatically being redirected based on data that's being harvested from planetary creatures like whales in this case. And there's a million other examples of things like that, where it's essentially almost a cybernetic system that's being set up right now. And it's very clear to me that many, many, many planetary challenges are going to be primarily dealt with not through institutions, with marble columns and people making decisions, but more through automated systems that are able to, directly impact the interface layer between the potentially human perturbation systems and the underlying systems that we want to like preserve or listen to in some way or another. So I think that's a huge debate. Is about where do you put your emphasis? Is it more on the technology end or is it more on the human institutions end? And my answer is a totally of both and personally, but there's a lot of people who are in this world who are way more on one end of that than the other. I try to track to the middle of that. I think in that context, the use of Ethereum, there's a million things that can be useful for this. Some of the ones I love the examples you gave, Josh, of like allowing more people who maybe are currently excluded from having a voice in various kinds of, decisions to be able to express their voice despite being institutionally suppressed, essentially. Great example. But there's also a ton of other things where, one project I've been tangentially involved in is a project to actually attach value to gorillas in Rwanda, so that they actually have value themselves, that they then can through Ethereum actually pay game wardens to protect them, right? So they actually become monetized. They're able to essentially issue payments, and this creates a financial incentive for people not to poach them, but actually to preserve them and to create ecotourism around them that will actually make their lives better and more sustainable. So there's all sorts of ways in which you could, use the chain to like actually create a more multi-species integration that I think is incredibly valuable.
I have a question for you, Josh, regarding Ethereum in the context of this discussion. I see one challenge as, and I'm going to practice some of my protocol study terms here. So planetary thinking, I see as this very meta, high level, kind of it's almost hard to really like talk about it in specifics. And then some of these planetary challenges as like the middle meso layer of like, okay, well, like practically what are some of the challenges that we can really like wrap our heads around? And Ethereum being kind of the micro like technical detail that like only in execution is it just like a matter of like, okay, like how do we practically do this? And like, should we use Ethereum or another chain? Or it seems like it's hard sometimes in conversations of like what really some of these bigger high level topics to talk and bring up Ethereum, because Ethereum feels like such a small, minor, like technical detail in the grand scheme of really, and it really kind of like adds an afterthought when you're actually doing the implementation or execution of a solution. Can you talk, Josh, about the work of the institutional secretariat at the Ethereum Foundation, trying to elevate like Ethereum researchers or developers and bring Ethereum into conversations at a higher level? I feel like, too often maybe crypto and blockchain is very much thought of as kind of like these like implementation details that don't really have a place in these like larger conversations. So I'd like to hear your
Yeah.
work on?
Sure, yeah, I can tell with that. And I have another thought too. Yeah, I mean, implementation detail, or sometimes even worse, like a solution in search of a problem. Where it's like back to the very early crypto days, where people were just like, well, we'll just put a blockchain on it, and a blockchain will magically solve all the difficult intransigent problems of this thing. And I think today we're at a more mature point where people understand a lot better what this actually offers. Um, yeah, I can say a bit about this. Is a new team at the EF, the Institutional Secretariat, and basically the idea of the team is to build, like, be a touch point and build relationships with certain kinds of institutions. So governments, large multinational organizations. This kind of captures a lot of our historic work with UNICEF and the UN. Most recently, you probably saw the news that the nation of Bhutan is building their national ID system on top of Ethereum, and that was also the product of a kind of a long series of engagements and education with institutions in Bhutan. And that's the basic
By
idea
the
of
way,
the team.
can I pause you for 1 second? I feel like Bhutan does not get enough love. I mean, obviously it's a small country, but those guys are so interesting on so many different levels, and they're so innovative. I mean, the gross national happiness thing hasn't really taken off, but like it's just such a great. I love what they do there.
Yeah.
I've never
But
been to that
they're
country.
trying things.
Yeah, they're trying.
I mean, I think
Isn't
that's
there isn't their history extremely wrought though, with like a lot of civil conflict, authoritarian regimes?
I don't really know that much about the
No?
history of
Okay.
Bhutan. I mean,
All
it might
right.
be. I mean, most places are, right? So it probably is.
You would be the expert in the room, Nils, on this.
But that's so cool, Josh. I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a very cool project, and it's still early days, but these are the kind of things that build on themselves over many years. So that's the idea of the team, and it's a little more targeted. It's really looking for specific opportunities to make a big difference. There's many touch points, of course, in the broader Ethereum ecosystem that many governments, organizations, institutions are talking to. I think the broader question was about maybe how is Ethereum just an implementation detail? And maybe one like kind of pivot I can add to this is that I think there's also there's a kind of diplomacy that happens within the Ethereum ecosystem that is interesting on its own sake, and I think will grow and become more important, and maybe also influence other forms of diplomacy, right? I mean, the most basic level of this is relationships between different chain ecosystems. Like a big topic and debate in the Ethereum ecosystem is what should the relationship be between Ethereum L1 and different chains that are maybe rollups, other forms of L2s, or just other chains that have a bridge and a relationship with this ecosystem. There's a kind of diplomacy and exchange that happens there as people are trying to figure out what their priorities are and how to balance maybe financial incentives and the values of their ecosystem and the value of their community. That's a very live thing that's happening right now, both within the ecosystem and then how those chain ecosystems relate to each other. And it's different in many ways because, again, there's not always just one organization like a State Department or something. There might be many. The kind of the ground that we're working on and what people are trying to prioritize is very different than other kinds of organizations. But if you kind of scale this out to a world where there might be thousands of rollups and where they have different relationships to Ethereum L1, and some of those rollups are built and maintained by large financial institutions or even governments, that starts to become a new space or a new domain for what is maybe effectively some kind of diplomacy in terms of what are these relationships going to look like, and how do we keep this overall system interoperable. So I think that's like an emerging thing that we are seeing the beginning of today, that will only kind of grow in scope and scale in importance over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, and by the way, just building on that point, I think another area, one of the things that Ethereum could be really crucial for enabling is essentially negotiations that happen, I don't want to say outside of, because that sounds like it's hostile. In some cases it might be, but like beyond governmental organizations, right? I mean, I think there's all sorts of opportunities that are emerging, and we're already seeing of like, subnational diplomacies between cities, right? Or corporations working with governments, local governments or national governments, or just corporations making decisions together. And a lot of times if we break, one of the other things that's happening that I think is interesting, Josh, in this context is, we're seeing the emergence of kind of hemispheric stacks that are increasingly separate from one another. Like there's a China stack, there's a US stack, maybe there's going to be a Europe stack or an India stack. And like the interoperability between these things is already beginning to break down. I think, Ethereum has a huge opportunity there. Your voting example was one of them, but like there's a whole bunch of other areas where they can create bridges between more and more closed off ecosystems. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities there for you guys to be the enabler of post-national diplomacy is the way I might describe it, right? Like it's like not necessarily centered on the nation state. It can be centered on a whole bunch of other different kinds of actors who want to do coordination and don't know how to do it and are maybe blocked by nation states from doing it in one way or another, or just struggling with collective action problems. I think all of those are areas where I think you guys have huge opportunities.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, when coming back to, I think, an early theme of this conversation, this is a world that's feeling more and more fragmented, more and more divisive and torn apart and balkanized. And one thing that I love about Ethereum and like inspires me to keep working on it is that Ethereum is one of kind of the few trends that's going in the other direction. That we are building this platform that has real durability, real heft, real hardness that people everywhere in the world are building on. Both large Chinese multinationals build on Ethereum and large American corporates build on Ethereum. There's a few other things maybe that have that kind of reach and scale and a very global nature. And then at the social level, it's such a global community. Working in the Ethereum ecosystem, it never sleeps because the people that I talk to and work with every day, both inside the EF and outside, are from all around the world. And there's few things you can do in the world that have such an international flavor as work in the Ethereum ecosystem. And I think that's a very underrated strength of the entire project.
I think that's a perfect sentiment to end off our conversation. Thank you so much, Josh and Nils, for this discussion on hardness and planetary thinking. I thought it was really interesting.
Thanks, you,
Christine. I had a great time. And Nils, it was very fun.
Super fun, Josh. Awesome. Thank you, Christine, for setting this up.
Of course, this is what Bridge Atlas series is about, building these bridges. Thank you so much also to everybody who is listening to this episode. I hope that you will join me again for another Bridge Atlas episode. Before we wrap up the episode, I just want to share some 3 important housekeeping items for all of the listeners. First, if you liked today's episode and this conversation and this discussion, be sure to give the episode a thumbs up on YouTube or wherever you're watching it, and subscribe to the Summer of Protocols YouTube channel. Also, if you want to stay engaged with what we were discussing, talk about some of these discussions with other listeners, please join the Summer of Protocols Discord channel, where you will be able to get access to all the other Summer of Protocol community and take part in the ongoing conversation. And finally, please check out all the show notes of today's episode, which will have all the links to both Josh and Nils' talks, past talks for Summer of Protocols. It'll also have more information on protocol study that you can use to keep your journey studying protocols going. So thank you again, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Josh and Nils, and I'll talk to everyone again on another Bridge Atlas episode another time.